Yeah. So the pigment in salmon roe is a carotenoid. It's called astaxanthin. It's also in shrimp, and that can affect DHT. Again, this is esoteric sort of nuance, but I wanted to get you guys that. All right. So since we're talking about glucose and stuff, let's move on to the comprehensive metabolic panel.
Let's do it.
So fasting glucose is one of the things we see in a comprehensive metabolic panel. We also see electrolytes, but we'll break it down for people so that they have a sense. Again, I want to do this to empower people so they understand what we're talking about. But comprehensive metabolic panel is a basic metabolic panel plus things like liver function tests, which we'll break down. So generally in a comprehensive metabolic panel, I'm going to see a sodium, a potassium, a chloride, a carbon dioxide, an anion gap, a BUN, a creatinine, a glucose, total protein, albumin, a globulin, albumin-globulin ratio, total bilirubin, alkaline phosphatase, ALT, AST. So that's a lot, but I'm going to walk you through what it all means. Basically, the first part, sodium, potassium, chloride, those are electrolytes in the serum. They don't really reflect tissue levels. Your body's going to keep those really, really tightly regulated unless you are metabolically deranged or super sick. So I don't get a ton of information there. If any of those are way out of the reference range, we have a problem and we should look into it. But generally, sodium, potassium, chloride are within normal.
Yeah, pretty much all of these. If I look at the past 5 tests I've had, they are almost exactly the same values. These are unbelievably tightly homeostatically regulated. And
they, again, the take home here is they do not reference tissue levels or body stores. If you want to know how much potassium you have in your body, the best is probably red blood cell potassium, which we'll talk about. And that's going to be in a micronutrient test. Again, you can get a serum magnesium, which could be included as an add-on to a CMP, a comprehensive metabolic panel, but that is also not going to be a good indication of total body stores. And you need to get a red blood cell magnesium if you want that. So the carbon dioxide is kind of a measure of acid-base balance, as is the anion gap. Those two things cause much consternation for medical students throughout the world. I don't think we need to dwell on them a whole lot. They should not be abnormal. The BUN is something we see a lot in carnivores. So BUN is blood urea nitrogen. It's often slightly elevated in people that eat a lot of protein or meat. It can be elevated due to dehydration or a high protein meal even the night before. Pathologically, we will see a BUN elevated when people have upper GI bleeding, like an ulcer in the stomach, but an elevated BUN in someone that had a large protein meal the night before is probably not a problem. What have you seen for your BUNs?
Mine are in the 19 to 22 kind of range, and they tend to hang around there, and that's in the reference range. My creatinine is generally 0.84. It's been 0.84 in every test, and that does elevate my bun creatinine ratio above the reference range of 22, but not by much.
So in medical school, we're always taught that the ratio between BUN and creatinine should be about 20. And if somebody has a higher, they may be dehydrated. As I said, there can be also limitations based on protein consumption.
Yeah, if you're eating a lot of protein, makes sense that that would go up.
The BUN will go up. But the creatinine is a measure of kidney function, but it's not a perfect measure of kidney function. Creatinine comes from the breakdown of muscle creatine. And in people who are extremely muscular, you can see creatine that is falsely elevated. And so if you are also eating a lot of protein, your creatinine may be slightly higher. Mine generally runs about 0.1. I'm a little bigger and maybe a little bit more muscular than Nathan. And so when I started doing a carnivore diet, I also got something called a cystatin C, which is another molecule that we can look at the levels in the blood to get a sense of kidney function. Neither of these are direct measures of kidney function. Creatinine is a molecule that is, again, a breakdown product of creatine, and we are measuring it in the blood because generally the kidneys should clear most of it. And if it accumulates, the kidneys are generally not clearing it, but it can also be overproduction. For instance, if you were supplementing with creatine, your creatinine would go up in the serum, and it would not mean that your kidneys weren't working. It would mean you had more breakdown. So I think in people that have muscularity or are supplementing with creatine or are eating a lot of protein, it's useful to get a cystatin C if creatinine is at all abnormal. But generally, if creatinine is high, we start to think about abnormal kidney function. It's rare. I've never seen it on a carnivore diet. There's no evidence that a carnivorous diet is going to hurt your kidneys. People.
Yep. There's also the EGFR, which is the estimated glomerular filtration rate, which I think is based on the creatinine.
Yeah, there's a couple of calculations.
Mine has been very high, 121. The estimated optimal range is greater than 60, so no issues with kidney function here.
You want your EGFR to be high. So you want the rate at which your glomeruli, which are these little magical units in your kidneys that do all the filtering, you want that flow rate in the kidney to be high. So it's not a bad thing. It's high. That's saying, hey, your kidney's filtering a lot of junk out. That's what we want. And then the next one on the CMP is the glucose, which is a fasting glucose. And this will be something that is the first measure of a diabetic problem in many people. Sometimes people who are eating a lot of protein or under stress will see the fasting glucose rise. And this is a question that we still don't understand on the carnivore community. My fasting glucose has been between, I would say, 81 and 90. Generally, if I'm eating a little less protein, a little more fat, it's on the lower side. And I liked my fasting glucose ideally to be in the 80s. When I see a fasting glucose above 90, I start to think, is this person eating too much protein? What's going on? But generally speaking, people on ketogenic and carnivore diets do not have many postprandial excursions of glucose, which is something I've talked about with Tommy Wood. These are called MAGEs. I believe it's median amplitude glucose excursion, which would be the amount of the amount that your blood glucose changes after you eat. Of course, this blood glucose measure is a 1 point in time measure in the morning first thing. If people have a high fasting glucose on a ketogenic or carnivore diet, I would recommend at least considering fat to protein ratios and maybe looking at glucose throughout the day. What have your glucose readings been?
Pretty wide range. Went from 60 to 103 with my latest one at 90. But I measure these things at home with the glucose monitor, ketone monitor, and I generally see it to be pretty flat in the 80s most of the time. So,
and Nathan wore a CGM for a little bit.
Yeah, I did 2 runs with a CGM and I got a flat line for my money.
Right. So this is when you were eating a carnivorous diet. There were essentially no variations in glucose throughout the day at all.
Yeah, pretty darn flat. I even cheated and had a pint of Ben & Jerry's and saw the world's tiniest rise in blood glucose. So that was kind of interesting to see. But
interesting. So you even had a bunch of sugar.
Yep. I think low glycemic load from ice cream was pretty good. Resulted in my blood glucose going to maybe 115 for an hour.
Huh. One of the things that I thought was really cool, Dom D'Agostino was talking on their podcast about how people could potentially use continuous glucose monitoring to get a sense of which foods might be triggering them immunologically. And this is a subject for a whole different podcast about CGMs and monitoring glucose, but I do think they're a fascinating tool. Generally on a carnivore diet, people don't get any bump in the blood sugar throughout the day. It's completely flat.
Yeah, there's no sense in wearing one with the carnivore diet unless you're just curious. It provides you no value and you see that your blood glucose is a flat line all day. I actually got bad readings because I'm low body fat percentage. If I went out on a bike ride, my interstitial glucose, which is what it's actually measuring, dropped below and it thought I was having a hypo.
Interesting. And I'll reiterate something that Tommy Wood said in a recent podcast with me regarding blood glucose levels, that that these median amplitude glucose excursions or these postprandial glucose excursions are dangerous because they may damage the glycocalyx, which is this sort of glycoprotein matrix on the inside of blood vessels. So keeping the blood sugar steady is very important. And though I do at least take notice of people that have fasting glucose levels that are slightly elevated, I don't get terribly worried about it if I believe that their glucose is stable throughout the day. A corollary measure to total glucose would be hemoglobin A1C, which is technically not included on a CMP, but a hemoglobin A1C is a 90-day average of blood glucose looking at the amount of glycosylated hemoglobin in the body. And generally, we want to see that below 5.5. I've seen mine a little bit higher than that when I'm eating more protein, but never anything too elevated. What are your H1Cs? Yours are even lower.
Yeah, mine was around 4.7, and I think I had another one that was at 5, so pretty stable.
I have a suspicion that some people with ketosis may have longer life in their red blood cells. And I've heard
that would make sense.
I've heard Rob Wolf at least postulate this in the past as well. And if the red blood cells live longer, there's going to be more hemoglobin on the hemoglobin molecule. It may not be as good. One of the extra credit tests I suggested was a fructosamine level. Fructosamine is probably a shorter measure, meaning a shorter time horizon measure of average blood glucose in the body. I've done that and seen that to be normal as well. So if we are curious about an A1C, we can get a fructosamine measure, which is probably going to reflect 2 to 3 weeks of average blood glucose rather than 3 months. But we should not see those elevated. Going back to the comprehensive metabolic panel, we see total protein and albumin. These are generally measures of nutritional status, and I don't ever see them abnormal in the people I work with. You'll get a percent albumin. Again, it should be normal. Percent globulin and the albumin globulin should be normal. Again, those are kind of measures of nutritional status. We know that lots of carnivores are getting plenty of protein, plenty of nutrients. Those should be normal. Bilirubin is a little bit interesting. Bilirubin is a breakdown product of hemoglobin and comes in two types. Generally, it's not measured or fractionated into direct and indirect on the comprehensive metabolic panel. Mine just is total. My total was 0.7 milligrams per deciliter. But direct bilirubin is also called conjugated bilirubin. In the liver, the body will take unconjugated bilirubin and conjugate it to a glucuronide moiety to make it conjugated bilirubin, which makes it water soluble, and it goes out in the bile and can go out in the urine as well. But it should not spill over into the urine. Unconjugated bilirubin is something that we should not see elevated. There are a number of differential diagnoses here. If you see elevated unconjugated bilirubin, generally you think of either hemolysis or Gilbert's syndrome, which is a genetic polymorphism in the enzyme, which does the glucuronidation of bilirubin in the liver. I'm getting pretty granular here. That is also the enzyme that is inhibited by piperine. So interesting there, but piperine is from black pepper. It is inhibited by UDP. It inhibits UDP glucuronyl transferase, and Gilbert's syndrome is a modification in that enzyme as well. So people with Gilbert's syndrome may have elevations of unconjugated bilirubin or hemolysis. Again, this gets into like pathologic states. If you have an elevated bilirubin, you need to see a doctor. If you have an elevated conjugated bilirubin, usually there is a liver disease or a cholestatic process, meaning a backup in the bile outflow from the gallbladder, gallstones, things like that. But if bilirubin is elevated, it's not something to ignore. Mine has never been abnormal. You ever seen anything funky on your billy?
Nope. Hanging around 0.3, 0.5.
I saw someone the other day who had an elevated conjugated bilirubin, and I think she has biliary disease, meaning she probably has gallstones that may be clearing that are elevating that. So if we see both, if you see both conjugated and unconjugated elevated, we call that a conjugated hyperbilirubinemia. If it's just unconjugated or indirect bilirubin, then it's there's a different differential diagnosis. Like I said, that could be hemolysis for a variety of reasons, which are sort of esoteric within medicine. One indication of biliary disease can come from a measure called alkaline phosphatase, which is ALP on the CMP. And if that is elevated, then we start to think about biliary stasis or elevation of, there are problems with the process of moving bile into the bile ducts. But that's generally, the differential diagnosis of elevated alkaline phosphatase is large. But if alkaline phosphatase is elevated, I would see your doctor. It's not something to ignore, but I've never seen it abnormal in a carnivorous human. Normal ILP for you too, I presume.
Yep, normal in the range. Same for AST and ALT. Yeah,
AST and ALT are interesting. Those are alanine aminotransferase and aspartate aminotransferase. Those are considered to be quote unquote liver enzymes. People always say like, oh, is eating a lot of meat or is eating a carnivore diet going to hurt your liver? And if we're thinking about liver function, these are the enzymes we look at. They are normal. Mine are 21. Mine are both 21 right now. And so I've not seen this in people. I have heard from some people that they sometimes get bumps in their liver enzymes. And what I think of with this is I wonder how much protein they're eating, and I have a suspicion that they may be eating too much protein. It is possible to overwhelm your liver's capacity to do the urea cycle and to turn nitrogen into urea, which is our water-soluble form of nitrogen from amino acids. I talked about this in my Ancestral Health Symposium talk and in the debate I did with Ted Naiman, which is now on my YouTube channel and was originally on Chris Bell's under Better, Stronger, Faster podcast. But the idea there is that all of our livers have an intrinsic capacity, which is genetically determined, to convert the nitrogen-containing amino acids in our diets into urea. And if we exceed that, it can spill over into ammonia, which is not a good thing. Perhaps in some people who are eating lots of protein, the ALT may go up as they're upregulating sort of the processing of amino acids in an adjustment phase. But if I do see an elevated or even high normal ALT or AST, I look into it more. Liver enzymes should not be elevated. Incidentally, if you guys want a mini medical school thing, the AST to ALT ratio is something we look for when people are using alcohol. And alcohol will tend to raise AST relative to ALT. AST occurs outside of the liver as well. ALT is generally specific for the liver, but AST can also be elevated by muscular injury. Going back to alkaline phosphatase, if alkaline phosphatase is elevated, we will fractionate alkaline phosphatase into heat labile or heat stabile. And the acronym we had from medical school was that bone burns, meaning that if the alkaline phosphatase is elevated because of something happening in the bones, probably a pathogenic process in the bones, it will be degraded by heat. And that if the alkaline phosphatase is coming from the liver, it will not be degraded by heat. So you can fractionate the ALP, the alkaline phosphatase, if it is elevated. Again, that's just extra credit. It's like first year medical stuff for you guys if you're interested. I hope this is not getting too granular, but I wanted to explain that stuff.
Good to know.
The other measure that we look at in the liver that is often not included is GGT. And this one is interesting. So I'm good friends with Dr. Mercola. When he heard that I was doing a carnivore diet and eating lots of meat, he was concerned that the iron might be causing oxidative stress, and he asked me what my GGT was. GGT stands for gamma-glutamyl transferase. It is involved in the formation of glutathione, which listeners may know is one of the endogenous antioxidants in the human body. Glutathione is what we use in the body to police antioxidant or to police free radicals. And so if a GGT is elevated, as I have seen in a couple of clients, I think about environmental toxins and oxidative stress. Mine is 12, which is the low end of the reference range, which was reassuring to Dr. Mercola, but I thought it was insightful for him to recommend at least, or to suggest, to ask me what it was. I had already checked it and I just told him, hey, it's always been low. So I have not seen my GGT go up on a carnivore diet, but I look at GGT and I add that to make sure that there is no oxidative stress. And I would recommend people add that to their CMP. Elevated GGT can also happen because of processes in the gallbladder or processes with the liver, but we can kind of triangulate around the AST and the ALT and perhaps the alkaline phosphatase if that's going on. So that is kind of a granular discussion of comprehensive metabolic panel. Anything else we should discuss there?
I think that pretty much covers it. Those should all be in the normal range. And if they're not, you've got some wonky homeostasis going on.
Yeah, there's something going on there. That should not be out of normal.
Do we want to run through the CBC Diff now?
Yep. Let's do that. The CBC in Diff is the complete blood count with differential, and that is a measure of all the blood cells. So blood cells are fractionated into red blood cells, white blood cells, and there are all these different lineages of white and red blood cells. And it is quite interesting to look at those. So a CBC with Diff is a very cheap and easy way to get a sense of a few things. So generally speaking, a CBC with Diff should be normal in carnivores and ketogenic people. I've never seen it to be that abnormal, but we start with usually it starts with the white blood cell count. And interestingly, you had a change in your white blood cell count, didn't you? Yeah,
I saw mine go down a good bit from my normal standard American diet to going on to keto and carnivore. My white blood cell count went from 6.7 thousand per microliter to as low as 3.6, so almost half the white blood cell count.
And the white blood cells, as we'll talk about, are fractionated in differential into multiple lineages, but I think that's probably a good thing. Similar to Nathan, I have had white blood cell counts which are traditionally slightly low, but I think this is a good thing. I think it means the immune system is not activated. There's a genetic predisposition, I think, in some people to have slightly low white blood cell count. Though if you do have a low white blood cell count, you should probably talk to your physician and make sure there's nothing else going on. Some immunologic phenomenon could cause that, but in a lot of people, a slightly low white blood cell count, as long as the differential is normal, are not pathogenic. And in this case, probably indicates that Nathan's immune system was more quiescent, more calm after.
Yeah, it was a drop in neutrophils, it looks like, based on my previous test there. But yeah, I think it would definitely make sense that the immune system calmed down. Didn't see many changes in the rest of the values, so it was just the white blood cell count and mainly the neutrophils that decreased.
Let's talk about the white blood cell lineages. So neutrophils are one of they're part of what is called the innate immune system. The adaptive immune system is sort of would be considered like T cells and B cells, but the neutrophils are always around. And those are responding to, generally, when we see neutrophilia or high amounts of neutrophils, we will, actually, I think I misspoke. Neutrophils are probably also considered part of the adaptive immune system. The innate immune system would probably be dendritic cells and macrophages. But the neutrophils will respond to bacterial infections, and the lymphocytes will respond to, generally speaking, viral infections. So when the neutrophils are high, we're saying, oh, what's it responding to? Is the body responding to a bacteria? What's going on there? But we break the white blood cell count, white blood cells down into neutrophils, lymphocytes, monocytes, eosinophils, basophils, and like I said, the neutrophils generally respond to bacteria. Lymphocytes generally respond to viruses, though it's not that simple. Monocytes are a pre-macrophage lineage. And eosinophils, when I see eosinophils elevated, I think about parasites or allergies. Basophils are also implicated in allergies. So different types of blood cells being high will sometimes give us a sense of what could be triggering an elevated white blood cell count. But we can look at numbers, absolute numbers of white blood cells and percentages. And in your case, Nathan, your neutrophils have been kind of borderline low and then into the normal ranges, but it's not something to get bogged down about. I do notice the thing that I would look at on everybody's profile, including yours, is the eosinophils I want to be low because I want to not miss a GI parasite.
Right.
If the eosinophils are high, that's the first thing I think of, or allergy or autoimmune disease, though allergy and autoimmune disease are probably reflected in high eosinophils rather than eosinophils being the cause of that.
Yeah, and I had very low eosinophils and basophils, so
yeah,
that's good.
And so Nathan's white blood cell count is within normal. His percentages are within normal. His absolute numbers are all pretty normal. So nothing crazy here. But when the differential counts of the different parts of the immune system are off, then it's worth looking into what might be going on there and repeating. The other part of the CBC is the red blood cell count, and it gives us 3 measures of how many red blood cells are in the body. It gives us a red blood cells, it gives us a hemoglobin, which is a measure of sort of the density of the amount of the oxygen carrying capacity, and then we get a hematocrit, which is another measure of how much oxygen carrying capacity we have. So we can count the red blood cells, we can look at how much hemoglobin is in there, and then we can look at sort of how densely they are able to carry oxygen. And again, these should be normal in people on ketogenic and carnivore diets. If there is anemia, which is a low red blood cell count, then we have to look at the further markers to get a sense of what might be causing the anemia.
Yep, and mine were in the normal range, except my last test where I look a little bit anemic because I I donated blood the week before.
There you go. Interesting. So your hematocrit, the red blood cell count, the hemoglobin, and the hematocrit all kind of tell us the same thing. A little bit of nuance there, but generally the one measure I look at is hematocrit. Yours has been 44 to 41. Mine most recently was 45. The riders in the Tour de France used to get excess hematocrit from doping and using things like EPO. They can push their hematocrit up. Hematocrit gives us a sense of oxygen carrying capacity. So if we have a high hematocrit, we will probably be able to do more aerobic exercise. Interestingly, one of the concerns people have when they go on exogenous testosterone replacement is that can push the hematocrit too high, and over excessive testosterone supplementation can cause hypercoagulability. If we get too many red blood cells in the blood vessels, then we can get blood clots, and that has killed more than one Tour de France rider.
Yeah, they get a super low resting heart rate, and they basically just clog up. They got to hop out of bed with their heart rate drops and hop on the bike for a few minutes before they get back to sleep.
I think it's actually just hypercoagulability. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they get hypercoagulable.
Don't sign me up for that. I'm happy with my casual bike riding.
Yeah, I mean, this is the problem that when people are on testosterone replacement, we talked about that a little bit earlier, that I think it's inappropriate in most males. We have to watch the hematocrit and make sure it doesn't go too high, lest we run into problems there. So if there is anemia, we look at something called the MCV, which is the mean corpuscular volume. Yours is within normal. It's in the 90s. Mine has been within normal. And but if it's too high, we think about a folate or a B12 problem. If it's too low, we think about an iron problem. Sometimes there can be both. You can have both high and low MCV, in which case something called the RDW will be elevated. So RDW is red blood cell distribution width. And if you have a high RDW and you are anemic, then it's possible that you have lots of sizes of your red blood cells. And if you have both small and large red blood cells, there's something going on with your blood that is abnormal. But if you are anemic, or that is having a low hematocrit, a low red blood cell count, low hemoglobin, you should look at the MCV and get a sense of whether that is high or low, which may give some indication for why you are anemic. There are other causes of anemia, such as anemia of chronic disease, which may be normal MCV. So there are microcytic anemias, normocytic anemias, and macrocytic anemias. The mean corpuscular hemoglobin is a little bit more of an esoteric measure. There's also an MCHC, and we talked about the RDW a little bit. But the MCV is really the one that you want to look at in conjunction with the red blood cell distribution with. If people listen to the podcast I did with Tommy Wood, he's done some very interesting research looking at RDW values correlating with longevity, suggesting that the higher the RDW, there may be a problem. So if people have elevated or even high normal RDWs, you would want to look at things like toxin exposure. We'll talk about heavy metals a little bit later, and also nutrients. Yours have all been normal as we're looking at this. Your RDW looks good, 12.5, 11.9. Yep. That's an ideal RDW, so I don't want to see the RDW too much higher than 12.5. The other thing on the CBC is the platelet count, which is a measure of clotting, one of the cells that are clotting, and that is normal, and it should be normal in most people. If that's abnormal, then we have something else going on. So let's move on to the omega-3 stuff. You've done a lot of stuff with your omega-3 indices and fatty acids.
Yeah, I've found that pretty interesting to track along with nutrient intakes. I've took my omega-3 ratio from about 10 when I first measured it. I'd eating a bunch of fish then, and I took it as high as 14, which put me above the reference range. And that's looking at basically the percentage of total omega-3 fatty acids, both EPA, DHA, and DPA, that make up red blood cell membrane. Yeah. So my current latest one was pretty high. I was looking at 14 or 9.7% omega-3 fatty acids total for an index of 10.1. Had pretty normal to low omega-6 fatty acids. And it's interesting to note that despite eating a ton of saturated fatty acids, my saturated fatty acids that actually make up the red blood cells puts me at a very low percentile, like the 4th percentile or something.
What was your saturated total percentage?
About 30%.
30%, wow. So let's just clarify for people. The omega-3 index is a sum of the red blood cell EPA and DHA. There are some... And the omega-3 index is something that someone came up with, and they've done some studies on it. But generally, when I'm looking at omega-3 fatty acid percentages of people, I want a red blood cell omega-3 fatty acid, not a serum fatty acid levels of omega-3s. The serum levels of omega-3s are inaccurate. And I will either look at the total omega-3 or the omega-3 index. I don't get hung up if the omega-3 index is not 8. Mine most recently was 7.7 with a total percentage of omega-3 for me at 10.9. What I really want to see is the relative ratios of ALA, being alpha-linolenic acid, which is an omega-3. That's coming from plants. Mine is essentially 0. DPA, which is an omega-3 that's not talked about much, which is docosapentaenoic acid, EPA, and DHA. And I want to make sure that people have a robust amount of EPA, DPA, and DHA. Where can you get that? Fish, grass-fed animal fat, which I eat a ton of, egg yolks. Those are great sources of omega-3s. And you're going to need some omega-6s to make arachidonic acid, which has signaling properties in the human body. But I do not recommend people consume excess amounts of omega-6 from plants, especially in the form of seed oils.
Yep. And it's worth noting that you can make pretty massive changes and improvements in these indexes and ratios from diet alone. I didn't do any supplementation with omega-3s. I just ate a can of sardines every day and some salmon and some salmon roe and grass-fed meat, and was able to take my omega index to the 99th percentile very easily, which had about 5% EPA, 5% DHA.
I'm not a fan of fish oil supplements. I've talked about this a little bit in the past. I think most of them are rancid and oxidized. I universally take people off of them and recommend that they get the omega-3 from food. Yep. I'm not a fan of krill oil. I think salmon roe is a great source of phospholipid-derived DHA. Again, I don't necessarily do it every day. See what works for you. But I don't recommend fish oil supplements to people.
Yep. Go for the fatty fish, cod liver, salmon roe, salmon.
Fatty meat.
All those kind of things. Fatty meat.
Iberian pork fat.
Potentially lamb. Lamb's that's like land salmon, people refer to it as. If you get some of that grass-fed New Zealand lamb.
Kidney fat, suet, yeah. I want to see the omega-6 total low. And then the other fatty acids that are shown on mine are saturated fat, which for me is 40.8%, and trans fat total, which is interesting. We were talking a little bit about this recently ahead of my talk at AHS. So people think trans fat, they think of it as negative. And there's one trans fat. If people want to get an omega-3 profile, there's one trans fat called elaidic acid, ELAIDIC acid, or maybe ELIADIC acid, that is from plants, that is a bad trans fat, that is from the hydrogenation of vegetable oils. But there are other trans fats in animal meat which are much more common to us evolutionarily and probably have good signaling properties. I talk about that in my AHS talk, which should be posted when this comes out, that there are a couple of trans fatty acids in animals, specifically conjugated linoleic acid and vicenic acid, that can also be included in this trans fat total.
Yep. And I saw my trans fat index and total trans fat increase. And I suspect that that's coming from the vicenic acid and CLA precursors that are in dairy and in animal fat.
Yeah. And again, there's interesting research on this. I don't think we fully understand what's going on with CLA. There is possibility that it's involved in satiety, is helpful for potentially weight loss. It potentially could modulate the immune system. It clearly modulates receptor systems and hormonal systems like PPAR, the peroxisome proliferator, alpha and gamma systems as well. So there are probably beneficial trans fats in animal meat, especially grass-fed animal meat, that signal to our body's hormonal systems and epigenetically or affect transcription in positive ways. So people might be saying, how can one trans fat be good and another be bad? And I think it has to do with the fact that where that double bond is affects the way that molecule is different. It's a completely different molecule, and they probably signal different things in our bodies in a hormonal way. It's very clear that fats, especially the omega-3s, all of them, arachidonic acid, conjugated linoleic acid, these can act as semi-hormonal, or they can affect hormonal systems with their signaling.
And this detailed omega fatty acid analysis, you can basically order on Amazon. There's a company called the Omega Quant that neither of us have any affiliation with, that was founded by the guy who did all the research on the omega-3 index. And you basically just bleed on a little postage card and send it back to Nebraska or something, North Dakota, and they send you a PDF with all of your fatty acid breakdown. And I found that, and a lot of people have commented that it seems like having a higher omega-3 index results in increased sunburn tolerance. And there's some research to back that up, that people's UV tolerance more than tripled with increased supplementation of EPA and DHA.
I've heard people say that about carnivore diets in general, that they feel like they have more tolerance to the sun. Michaela Peterson was talking about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting side note on that.
Yeah.
Omega-3s are going into other stuff.
Let's talk about the thyroid hormones a little bit. So a lot of times people go to the thyroid. When a lot of times when people go to the doctor, they'll just get a TSH, and that's woefully inadequate in my opinion. TSH is a precursor, or it's a signaling molecule. It's a hormone that's secreted from your pituitary that goes to the thyroid. Especially maybe it's secreted from your hypothalamus that goes to the thyroid, and it signals the thyroid to make T4, which is the precursor to T3. Both T4 and T3 are active in the periphery. There is peripheral conversion of T4 to T3 in the human body. But generally speaking, T3 is the main active hormone. In states of stress, T4 can also be converted to reverse T3, which is not active in the human body and sort of is a signal to the body, like put the brakes on. When we're fasting, if we're not getting enough calories, the reverse T3 can be high. So when I see a thyroid panel, which I think is one of the crucial panels, I want to see TSH, T4, free T4, T3, and reverse T3. Now, I just want people to understand that TSH, if it's low, means that there is a hyperthyroid condition. If TSH is high, it means that the body is working very hard to signal to the thyroid to put out more thyroid hormones. So TSH goes in the opposite direction of your thyroid hormones. Generally, I want to see TSH below 2. My TSH is generally around 1, 1.5. And I'll talk about my other thyroid hormones as well. My T4 most recently was 5.7, 5.2 with a free T4 of 1.1. And my T3, though originally within normal, when I started a carnivore diet, generally bumped a little bit below the reference range. Mine is now 55 to 65. People who criticize ketogenic carnivore diets will point to this and say, haha, you're hypothyroid, except I'm not hypothyroid because I'm not gaining weight. I don't have problems with my metabolism, nor do I have cold intolerance or low energy. And I think this goes back to tissue sensitivity. And this is actually a pretty well-documented phenomenon that on ketogenic diets, tissue sensitivity to T3 probably increases, and we don't need T3 to be as high. So if people are not having symptoms of hypothyroidism, I do not worry about a slightly low T3 or free T3 on a ketogenic diet. It seems to be a feature. What have your thyroid hormones done?
They're pretty much in the same range as yours. My total T3 is on the lower end, like you suggested, but all the other values are within normal range. TSH is in the same as yours, around 1. T4, 6 to 7. All the rest are in the normal range.
Interesting. And my reverse T3 is 15. Did you ever get a reverse T3?
I did. It was 15 to 12 to 18, it looks like.
Yeah. If the reverse T3 is elevated, again, I think about stress, sleep, things like that. That should not be elevated. But a slightly low T3, I don't worry about unless someone is having a ton of symptoms. And the other thing to think about with thyroid that many physicians don't do is thyroid antibodies. I want to see if there's an issue. I want to know if the thyroid is off. I want to know if the body's having an immune reaction. This is antithyroglobulin and antithyroid peroxidase. I've never had a problem with these. They're quite low. Both of them are sort of below the detectable limit of normal for me. You've never had elevated thyroid hormones?
Nope. All below detectable.
And if people have elevated thyroid antibodies, that's where we start to think about autoimmune thyroiditis. Generally, we're thinking about Hashimoto's, but there are other issues as well. There is also another antithyroid antibody, which can be an antithyroid receptor antibody, which can sometimes happen in hyperthyroid, which is a Graves condition, Graves hyperthyroid. Again, this is a little esoteric, and you should talk to your physician about that. But I think it's very important to check a full thyroid panel. Now, anything else you want to say about thyroid, Nathan?
No, I don't think it's really that interesting, and most of the time. And
it's super interesting.
Well, it's interesting, but my values are all in the reference range, and we know why T3 is low. So I think that pretty much covers it.
Yeah. So don't believe the hype, and don't listen to the keto skeptics necessarily. If you're not feeling good, then something else to imagine or investigate there. But don't listen to the keto skeptics saying that your T3 needs to be within the reference range on keto. That just seems like a physiologic phenomenon. And I did a talk with Jamie Seaman, who's an OBGYN in Nebraska, on my YouTube channel people can refer to, where we talk about the tissue sensitivity of thyroid hormones. And we reviewed a paper during that talk where we talked about this phenomenon that sometimes there are pretty clear as evidence that the tissue sensitivity can change. Let's look at a little iron studies, because people sometimes worry about excess iron on carnivore diets. I think that you need to get a number of things for this, which would be, like I said, TIBC, transferrin, ferritin, and serum iron. What have you seen for your iron values?
My TIBIC was 306 and 350.
TIBC?
Yep.
TIBIC.
Sorry, yes.
That's total iron binding capacity.
My iron saturation was 22%, and my ferritin was 127, except in my most recent lab right after I donated blood, in which case it was lower, which is expected because I lost a pint of my own blood.
Right. So, and then did you ever get a serum iron?
Yes, it was 67 and 66.
Okay. So for iron, to really know what's going on with iron, we have to look at serum iron, which is how much iron is in the blood. TIBC is sort of a measure of how much space there is to bind iron. So total iron binding capacity. And transferrin tells us kind of the same thing, as does the transferrin saturation. And the ferritin is a measure of stored iron. So the nuance here is that sometimes if people have a polymorphism or a mutation in something called hemochromatosis, which is rare but happens, they can have excess iron storage. This is why we should be checking iron, just making sure. In that case, the transferrin saturation will be super high because your body will be binding up all the iron. Your TIBC, meaning the total iron binding capacity, will be low, and the ferritin can be quite high. And that is a dangerous situation. It doesn't mean you can't eat a carnivore diet. It means you should do phlebotomy regardless of the diet you are eating. The other criticism leveled against the carnivore diet is the fact that ferritin may go up on a carnivore diet, although ferritin is tightly linked as an inflammatory marker, and so we have to take it in the context of inflammation. If ferritin goes too high, or if CRP is elevated, that can elevate ferritin. But generally, what I have not seen, and Nathan is a good example of this, is that generally eating a lot of meat will not cause the iron stores in your body to go too high. That is a fallacy. Dr. Mercola was worried about it, but I do not see it. It could happen in the rare situation where somebody had hemochromatosis, but you would know if you had that, or you should know if you have not been checked for that and your iron is off or your ferritin is very high, then you should be checked for that. But ferritin, mine stays around 200, meaning I have plenty of iron stored because I'm eating lots of iron in meat, but our bodies have a way to get rid of excess iron. They do this normally through the intestines. We slough off the cells. We can bind iron in our small intestinal epithelial cells and then slough them off. If you eat a lot of iron, it will not just accumulate and go rampant and cause oxidative stress like many people suggest.
Yep. The absorption and excretion are both nicely homeostatically regulated. Our body does a nice job there.
Yeah. So the idea, this is one of the criticisms of the carnivore diet that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. If your ferritin is elevated, you should look at inflammatory markers as well and figure out what is causing inflammation, which is sort of the theme for everything.
Yep. Generally, that increase is just it being an acute phase reactant.
Yep. Acute phase reactant being like an inflammatory marker with fibrinogen, HSCRP, ferritin. Those are all acute phase reactants. Sometimes we use something called ESR, which is erythrocyte sedimentation rate. So we talked about lipids. We talked about insulin. We talked about hemoglobin A1C. We talked about comprehensive metabolic panel, CMP. We talked about thyroid and hormones. We talked about iron. Let's dig into a few of these sort of more esoteric tests before we close. What else have you checked on yourself?
I've done a lot of the vitamins and minerals. I did vitamin D, magnesium, B12, folate, lead, mercury, vitamin A, copper, zinc, selenium, and CoQ10.
Let's talk about the vitamins and minerals next. And I left this out of the list, perhaps in the intro of this video. I'll have to go back and revise the list. But vitamin D should definitely be on the list for everyone. But the vitamins and minerals are quite interesting. And this falls into sort of the micronutrient panel. You can get these in the serum, and there are multiple labs. Genova does a test called the Nutra-Eval, where they talk about this. But you'll want to check B12, serum level of B12, and the corresponding marker is methylmalonic acid. Those should be normal. No one should be deficient in B12. If you are deficient in B12, we have a major issue. Serum folate is not as valuable as red blood cell folate. B6 should be measured in the blood. The best way to measure vitamin D is 25-hydroxyvitamin D. And I'll just say a word about that, and then I'll hear your values for those blood tests if you have them, Nathan. I think that sun is uniquely beneficial to humans. And I am not convinced that supplementation with vitamin D, that would be cholecalciferol, in a pill or a capsule is going to give us the same benefits of getting in the sun. Now, there's a whole podcast about this probably in the works or whatnot, but that will be my short answer there. I think people should not burn. They should not overexpose to the sun, but sunlight I think is uniquely valuable. And I do not take vitamin D. I want all of the vitamin D in my blood to reflect sun exposure. And I think that studies would suggest that vitamin D, at least in terms of beneficial outcomes, is probably a proxy for sun exposure. Supplementation with vitamin D doesn't seem to have anywhere near the benefits that getting it from the sun might.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Curiously, my vitamin D, I was supplementing for a little bit and then decided that was silly because the sun exposure part makes sense. But I increased my sun exposure a lot, and it's summertime in Seattle, and it's been pretty sunny, and my vitamin D went down. So that's kind of curious. What's
your vitamin D now?
It is at 27 nanograms a milliliter, which puts me below the reference range.
I generally like to see vitamin D above 45. When I was in Seattle and getting sunlight every day for like an hour, I had a vitamin D about 50, 55.
Interesting.
And now my vitamin D is 44, so I need to get a little more sun, but it's work. I mean, that's one of the reasons I moved to San Diego was to get vitamin D more easily.
So I have been looking into my low RBC magnesium, which I think is also potentially related to the low vitamin D. So it could be that my magnesium status is impacting my vitamin D status. So I'll have to up the supplementation on magnesium because that can be sort of difficult to get in the diet.
Yeah, we can talk about magnesium when we talk about more of the micronutrients. You did B12 and MMA and RBC folate, right?
I did B12 and RBC folate and serum folate. Those are all above or in the normal range.
Right. The other one that I'll comment on with a little bit of sparkle in my eye is my vitamin E, which is above the reference range. So I'm waiting for you, Rhonda Patrick. People often say the carnivore diet doesn't have enough vitamin E, and I say hogwash because there's probably tons of vitamin E in grass-fed animal fat, and my vitamin E and the vitamin E of many carnivores I work with is above the reference range. There's tons of vitamin E on a carnivore diet. Did you ever check vitamin E?
I never did check vitamin E. I'll have to do that on the next panel.
The other thing that I have had checked is coenzyme Q10. This is one of the electron acceptors in the electron transport chain of mitochondria, and generally correlates with mitochondrial health. I don't have anyone that I work with supplement because it's so robust in animal foods. My CoQ10 has been between 2.4 and 2.7. I've seen coenzyme Q10s as high as 3.5 micrograms per ml. They are so robust on carnivore diets. I see the highest levels of CoQ10. What has yours been?
3.
He's got a bigger coenzyme Q10 than me. We see also some of the other micronutrients here. I have had a red blood cell magnesium as well. Mine is a little higher than Nathan's, but still kind of on the low end. Mine is 4.7. Magnesium, I'll just comment about. It's hard to get in our diets. I talked about this in the podcast with Max Lugavere. Even from plant foods, magnesium is hard to get in our diets. And I do supplement. I wonder if there is some balance between magnesium, potassium, and sodium, and we haven't totally figured it out. But I don't think it's harmful to supplement with a good magnesium supplement. I've talked about those in the past. Magnesium supplementation may cause loose stool for people, but it's worth it to check your RBC magnesium. Also, I've checked serum calcium, which is included generally on the comprehensive metabolic panel. It's not a great measure of calcium, but it tells us something. I will also note in terms of micronutrients that my plasma copper was 92, which is in the middle to low end of the reference range. Many people ask me, can I eat lots of liver a day and worry about copper toxicity? I say, don't worry about it because zinc protects you from copper toxicity. You're going to get a lot of zinc if you're eating other animal foods like spleen or liver or muscle meat. And it is basically impossible or virtually impossible, very difficult to get copper toxic if you are eating any amount of zinc. The reverse is not true. And I have concerns about people who are supplementing with zinc without copper. You definitely can get copper deficient if you do not eat copper-rich foods, those being liver. I think there are some mushrooms like shiitake mushrooms that are good for copper, but we need to get copper in our diets. And I think liver is a good source. And the fact that I'm eating a ton of liver and my copper is nowhere near elevated is a good indication that we don't have to worry about copper in liver causing toxicity. What other micronutrients have you had?
Yeah, I did zinc, copper, and selenium, and they were all within the normal range.
What was your RBC zinc?
I didn't do RBC for these. These were serum measures. 106 for zinc, and 71 and 106. No, sorry, the other way around. 106 for zinc, 71 for copper. And selenium? Selenium was also 106.
And the units on the zinc, plasma zinc, right?
Plasma zinc, that was micrograms per deciliter.
Right. My plasma zinc is 103. My RBC zinc is 1407. So pretty robust zinc status for me too. My selenium is within the normal range. It's plasma selenium, micrograms per liter. Mine is 115.
Curiously, when I was trying to get more zinc, my zinc went up and my copper went down. So that's
how it works.
That does align that with that. I was eating a lot of oysters.
Yeah. We need a source of copper in our diets. Absolutely. And I spoke about this in one of the new blog posts on my website, which is now carnivoremd.com, that if we are not getting enough copper, we can run into problems, and that copper deficiency manifests in a way that looks like B12 deficiency, which is neurologic symptoms, balance, and coordination. Copper deficiency is no joke.
Is that Wilson's disease?
No, Wilson's disease is copper toxicity. It has to do with ceruloplasmin mutations, and people can accumulate copper in Wilson's disease.
So you haven't gotten Wilson's disease from eating too much liver?
No, and Wilson's disease is a genetic thing necessarily, and there are characteristic changes in the eye which happen in Wilson's disease. It's one of these zebras everybody gets excited about in medical school and nobody ever sees it. But if people do have a high copper level, then they should be ruled out for Wilson's, which you can do with the genetic test or looking at the ceruloplasmin and maybe the free copper in the blood. Wilson's can manifest with psychiatric symptoms. So it's a very rare thing, a genetic sort of high copper.
So I also tested the bad heavy metals, lead and mercury, and my lead was below the detectable limit. That's good. Not eating any paint chips or anything. And my mercury was 3, which is below what you'd want.
Yeah, I do think it's valuable for people to have blood toxic metals at least once. I've done arsenic, cadmium, lead, mercury, and thallium. All of mine were quite low. The first one to think about is lead, which is micrograms per deciliter. You definitely want your lead below 2. Mine was 1.1 and 1.3. The cadmium was very low. My arsenic was very low. My mercury was less than 0.7 in the blood, so I beat you there. And my thallium was quite low. Many times people ask, should they do urine heavy metals? Should they do provoked with DMSA? Is hair accurate? My answer is that we do not have reference ranges for provoked urine heavy metals, and I don't recommend it unless you're doing it with someone who really knows what they're talking about. I think blood metals are generally accurate or generally adequate in the beginning, and if something is elevated in the blood, you might want to know. If you have a ton of mercury fillings, you may want to do a provoked urine mercury, but generally speaking, I think blood toxic metals are a good place to start, but you do want to look out for mercury in fatty fish or big fish like swordfish, tuna.
Swordfish, tuna, king mackerel, those are all not so great.
Not so great. I have seen very high mercury levels in a client who was eating a lot of sea bass, and she had to do a lot of support with glutathione, sauna, and things like that. Lead is generally in drinking water. If people have a high lead, you'd want to look into where that's coming from. That is abnormal, and that will definitely mess with your quality of life. Cadmium is in seafood, specifically shellfish. Doesn't mean you can't ever eat shellfish. Just be aware that if you eat a lot of shellfish, you could be pushing a lot of cadmium. Arsenic, generally in drinking water. Be careful with that. Look at where you're living. Get a good filter.
Apple seeds.
Apple seeds. Yeah.
Guess you're not eating those if you're a carnivore, but probably don't eat them anyway.
Don't go on an apple seed binge. But I think we should know what's going on with our metals. I will just say that I think people are overly concerned about metals, and there's a lot of fear mongering about metals. I don't worry about them a ton. If the blood levels look good like this, just know where you could be getting contamination.
Makes a lot of sense. And from what I understand, intaking selenium can help either clear out or prevent damage from mercury.
Glutathione peroxidase is one of the enzymes involved in the cycling of glutathione and is a selenium-dependent enzyme. Yeah. So selenium is also important for the conversion of T4 to T3. So if people do not have adequate conversion of T4 to T3, which you would only know if you did T4 and T3 levels, not just a TSH, there is the potential of selenium deficiency, which is why this all kind of fits together.
Yep. And you can get selenium in other fatty fish like sardines. I know they're a good source, and I assume it's in animal meat as well.
It's in animal meat, it's in liver, it's in all those parts of the animal. Yep, all those bits. The other thing I'll say is that there's good evidence that humans can at least excrete some of the heavy metals, mercury, lead, I believe arsenic or cadmium, I have to confirm this, via sauna. And so sauna can help with some, not all of them, but some.
Interesting.
And if people have high levels of heavy metals, they can consider a short course of glutathione supplementation. But I'm not a great fan of glutathione supplementation long term, but that would be in the context of all the metals. So let me see, is there anything we didn't cover? We've gone through a lot.
Yeah, I think we've covered almost all the tests that I've had done.
The only thing we haven't covered is leptin, which is kind of this measure of, it's a hormone involved in satiety. If anyone has an elevated leptin, they might be considered leptin resistant, and there's a good reason to figure out why you're leptin resistant. It's probably inflammation. But sometimes I like to add leptin to the profiles just to get a sense of that to contribute. Now, in terms of other tests, we've gone through that was a big blood test. Again, on the blog post on my website, I'll have all the tests listed. Hopefully this has been helpful. With a lot of clients, I will do more than blood testing depending on the issues they're having. I may do something like an organic acids test, which is comprehensive and complex and way beyond the scope of this podcast, but that may give me a little bit more indication of metabolism of vitamins and minerals and whatnot. But the organic acids is sometimes valuable. I also do a lot of GI testing. Rather than looking at the microbiome per se, I'm looking for parasites and pathogens, things like blastocystis, things like H. pylori, things like worms and amoebas. And I can do that with something called a GI map, which does quantitative polymerase chain reaction and amplification of things in the gut. And then there's all sorts of other tests, but I think that people don't need to worry about those. If you have a lot of gut issues, you might think about doing a breath test for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Working with a functional medicine practitioner, you should be able to figure out pretty fast if you have clinical symptoms of SIBO. But if you have a lot of GI symptoms, you probably want to do a gut test in addition to blood testing. But I think that with the comprehensive blood testing that we are describing here and a gut test, you'd be pretty well pretty well covered. I know you said you've done whole genome sequencing.
Yeah, I've done 23andMe, a full exome sequence, and now 2 full genome sequences because I guess, as they say, a fool and his money are soon parted, and I've been tricked by the magic of genetics. But I figure it won't go old. My genome's not changing. So as we learn more, I can go through it and see, what's interesting. And I do this stuff as kind of a citizen scientist researcher. So maybe I'll publish my whole genome somewhere. And I think with this podcast, I'll publish my lab results. They're already on my Twitter, but yeah, Paul can link to this spreadsheet with all my lab results.
Yeah, we'll link to the spreadsheet with all of Nathan's lab results, and we can put some of my lab results in a spreadsheet as well. The other thing I would say is that sometimes 23andMe is valuable. I do think that looking at single nucleotide polymorphisms is valuable. It's much less comprehensive than an exome sequence, but
and the effect sizes of these things are teeny tiny. Find a gene that claims it's a 1.5x increased risk of high cholesterol, and the actual change in cholesterol is 1 milligram a deciliter or something, and you just kind of go, well, it's not useful. It doesn't have clinical relevance. But, hey, these things go on sale for Black Friday. You can get a whole genome sequence for $350, and they give you, the VCF file, which is all the variants versus the reference genome. They give you eventually the FASTQ and BAM files. So you basically get, a ridiculous amount of data, raw data about your genome that you can run through all kinds of tools if you're a nerd like me and see what's going on with your genome. But these things don't have great clinical significance unless you have some kind of bizarre undiagnosed problem where kind of genetics is your last hope. But if you can get a whole genome sequence for under $500, that's below the cost. And this happens, every once in a while from people like Veritas and a couple other genome sequencing places.
Yeah, I generally don't find a whole lot of utility to 23andMe, but it's interesting. Occasionally the SNPs. I mean, if you can see hemochromatosis on a 23andMe.
I'm a carrier. That's shown up in mine. That's one of the only interesting genes that I'm a carrier for is hemochromatosis. We
did a whole podcast with Tommy Wood. You can see your ApoE4. You should listen to that podcast if you have questions about that. That was eye-opening. You might see polymorphisms in LDL receptor or perhaps familial hypercholesterolemia on a 23andMe, but generally speaking, they're academically interesting. They very rarely change the way that I manage patients or we change in our lives. We're just trying to do overall live a good life. So hopefully that's helpful for you guys. I wanted to talk about blood work. I basically wanted to do a podcast where I run through blood work and explain it to people. Probably people are going to find this one quite technical. I hope it's helpful. You'll probably have lots of questions. You should talk to your physician about them. But blood work is very powerful, and I wanted to empower people to know what to get and what it means. Again, if you have questions, you should be working with a functional medicine doc to interpret all this stuff. But the other take home is that a carnivore diet will not kill you, and you might just feel amazing, and that neither Nathan nor I have seen any major changes or derangements in testosterone, kidney function, liver function, thyroid function, anything that's concerning to us for inflammation. A carnivore diet, I believe, is our ancestral diet and is not going to kill you. It's just going to make you feel awesome.
Yep. And there's a lot of nuance to a lot of these things that we can't really cover. So it's definitely worth working with a doctor to do research on some of these things if you have kind of abnormal values, because these things get really complicated really quickly.
And many of these change a little bit in the setting of ketosis.
Yep.
And that is the other thing I've talked about before that people need to be aware. And I wish that mainstream physicians were a little more aware of how some of these numbers might change in a ketogenic state, specifically thyroid, potentially other hormones, definitely cholesterol. Some of these things may alter, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing. It just means, hey, your body looks a little different when you're not running on carbohydrates.
Yep.
Cool. Man, thank you for this. What is the most radical thing you've done recently, Nathan?
Well, I flew down here for AHS and I started a podcast.
That's right. We talked about that and I'm excited to hear it. So cool. What was your favorite talk at AHS?
I thought Tommy Woods was really good. He talked about kind of the bullshit behind a lot of the genetic polymorphism research. And he had some really nice graphics. I'm going to help him make his graphics a little nicer with some Python code. And hopefully we can show people that some of these things are kind of more hype than useful. Awesome.
Yeah. Tommy is a good friend of mine, and I've released a podcast with him recently. And I missed that talk of his because I was working busily on mine. But that's cool. I want to check that one out and some of the other ones. So thanks for being on with this, man. This is a long one. Dude, this might be the record. Let's pack it up, bro.
If you made it this far, congrats.
Congratulations. You've learned a ton. Hopefully this is helpful. You guys asked for it. I delivered. Don't say I didn't do anything for you. Have a great day, guys. Stay radical. All right. Does your brain have a six-pack? I mean, between the episode last week with Dave and Siobhan and this episode, your brain has a six-pack, you guys. This is insane how much information we have shared. I hope these have both been helpful. If you found this episode to be too intense, please let me know. I can do another more high-level episode. Again, I will do a blog post about this in the future, which will have much of this stuff broken down in word form, but I am in the trenches with my book. So that is what is going on with me. You may have noticed that I'm on Instagram a little bit less because Instagram is not the best use of my time right now. The best use of my time is writing this book to help as many people as possible, and that's my real goal long term. So I appreciate your support and all of that stuff. If you like my work, if you appreciate this podcast, leave us a review on iTunes. It is doing awesome. I mean, every week the downloads are going up and up and up. We have tens of thousands of downloads a week now, which is amazing. And we will get into the top 10 on iTunes pretty much every week for health and fitness when we release the podcast. So that's crazy. Since I've only been doing it a few months, it really makes me feel good to know that I'm bringing value to you guys. I released an episode of The Insider today, which is Monday, the day before this podcast is coming out. So if you want to subscribe to the Fundamental Health Insider, which is my newsletter, check it out at my website, which is carnivoremd.com. If you want to work with me, send me an email or a message through the website. The contact information is there. I do see clients virtually and in person in San Diego, though most of my efforts these days are concentrated on book and creating content for you guys. I do see patients, however. I do see clients. I like working with people in person. All right, so what else? I have been surfing a lot. I've been on the foil. It's been an amazing time for me. I am super excited about the book. I'm going to share some covers in the future. Again, the title is The Carnivore Code, Unlocking the Secrets to Optimal Health by Returning to Our Ancestral Diet. I talk about all kinds of cool stuff in the book. I am so excited to share it. It's going to be out probably in January of this year, and I want it to be amazing. Check out Nathan at Nathan=1 on Twitter. We talk about his podcast during this episode. He is a super smart engineer doing really cool stuff. Check out his podcast if you want to learn more. And I always appreciate his assistance with these podcasts and being my foil, giving me someone to talk to about blood work. He is a great guy. Check him out. If you are in Seattle, reach out to him and go buy a steak with Nathan because he's a good dude. All right, you guys, I think that's it for this week. Please let me know how you enjoy the podcast. Subscribe to The Insider if you want to get the inside track for all this stuff. Support me on Patreon, Paul Saladino MD, if you appreciate my work. I often post stuff there weeks in advance. There are all kinds of stuff, things, sundry items posted at Patreon now that are not available to the public because I want to give some value to people there. So support me on Patreon if you like my work. Carnivore MD is my website. The Insider is there. Subscribe to that. Check out all my stuff. Please support White Oak Pastures. They are doing great work. Vote with your dollars. The plant-based industry is baloney, baloney, baloney. In fact, they're not even baloney. They're just fake baloney. They're bamboo baloney. And they are actually contributing more to the environmental impact on the planet. And it's obviously creating ill health for humans. So don't buy the hype with that. I love that Sean Baker is talking about athletes being game-changered. All these vegan athletes are getting injured and knocked out of competition. So clearly, I mean, duh, like plant-based diets are not good for humans. And eventually people are going to wake up to this and the carnivore movement, animal-based movement, carnivore-ish diet will rise and people will feel better, which is what we're going for. It's not about being right. It's about helping people. So I appreciate you all. Much love. I will see you guys soon, maybe next week, probably next week, which will probably be Michaela Peterson's episode. And I am hoping and praying that she will do a steak dance for me. And we will post that, and she will be super excited to share that. All right, guys, have a great week. I will talk to you soon.